Scotland. 1297. A country under occupation does not just lose land, it loses sleep. The roads belong to someone else's patrols. The courts speak in someone else's voice. The gallows at the edge of the market square creak like a public clock, measuring time in fear. Edward I of England, the man history calls the Hammer of the Scots, did not want a simple victory. He wanted Scotland to forget it had ever been a kingdom, to forget the taste of self-rule, to forget freedom the way you forget a dream after a long winter. If you want history with the sharp edges left intact, like, subscribe, and ring the bell right after this opening. Tonight, we are not standing on Stirling Castle's heights to admire the view. We are down in the mud, where boots sink and the river wind cuts through wet cloth. Out there, a narrow wooden bridge, just planks, posts, and rotten rope will become a choke point that traps thousands. It will turn imperial confidence into panic, and it will leave a scar on England's pride so deep that kings will spend years trying to burn it out of Scotland's memory. At the center of this story is not a crowned hero or a polished knight. It is a taxman, Hugh Cressingham, a fat official swollen on confiscated grain, on seized cattle, on fines ripped from cracked peasant hands. When Scots spoke his name, they did not speak as if describing a man. They spoke as if naming a disease. He was the human shape of occupation, the kind of parasite that never swings a sword, yet kills more people than the battlefield ever will. And that is why Stirling Bridge was not just a victory, it was a message. In an age when power was performed through armor, horses, and sealed parchments, the Scots proved that geography, patience, and hatred could break steel. When survival becomes the only rule, victory is not merely defeating an enemy, it is creating a memory that makes the enemy afraid to return. To understand why a bridge could change history, you have to understand the machine Edward built. After the death of Alexander III and the chaos of disputed succession, Edward arrived as an arbiter and stayed as a master. He forced Scottish nobles to swear submission, installed English administrators in key positions, and turned law into a whip. Need money for wars in France and Wales? Scotland will pay. Need wages for garrisons? Scotland will pay. Need a lesson so other regions don't rebel? Scotland will bleed. In the villages, occupation did not look like heroic battles. It sounded like doors kicked in at dawn. It smelled like smoke from barns burned as punishment. It tasted like bread cut thinner each week because another levy was due. People were forced to quarter English soldiers, surrender livestock, hand over grain, and stay silent when their homes were searched. Every harvest carried a second fear. Besides weather, how much would the collectors take this time? A bad year might mean hunger. A bad year under occupation could mean death. Among the officials enforcing this system, Hugh Cressingham stood out as a symbol of humiliation. As Edward's treasurer in Scotland, he turned suffering into columns of numbers. Scottish chroniclers describe him as greedy and contemptuous, the kind of man who believed receipts proved righteousness. He didn't simply collect, he degraded. He spoke of Scots as property that needed managing, not people who had rights. To Cressingham, short payment was rebellion, and rebellion deserved punishment. The most frightening part was the feeling of being trapped. A farmer could not sue Cressingham. A family could not flee without being hunted and branded. When people are stripped of everything, they reach a point where they no longer fear losing more. The hatred for men like Cressingham spread through the countryside like smoke. It moved from hearth to hearth, carried by stories of a mother hiding the last handful of grain under a floor stone, of a father dragged to court for missing forced labor, of a teenager hanged, as an example. This is how resistance is born. State violence is meant to crush rebellion, but it also manufactures rebels. Every public punishment teaches the oppressed that they are not viewed as human by the people ruling them, and when you are treated like livestock, you eventually find someone who speaks your rage out loud. William Wallace stepped into that vacancy. Wallace was dangerous precisely because he did not begin as a great lord. A man with little to lose can gamble everything. The early records of his life are thin, but the violence of his era is not. When Wallace killed the English sheriff at Lanark and sparked a chain of attacks, it was not random cruelty. It was the reflex of a society pushed to the edge of starvation and humiliation. To England, it was murder. To many Scots, it was proof that the occupiers could bleed. Wallace fought like a hunted man. He did not seek open fields where armored cavalry could crush him. He chose narrow roads, wet ground, and places where a warhorse could not build speed. He understood that English strength depended on space and deployment. If you deny them that, their advantages melt away. Local knowledge became a weapon. Peasants knew where the marsh swallowed a horse, where the river ran deep, where men could hide in reed beds and vanish. He also understood symbolism. Every burned tax station was not just wood and paper. It was a statement that the occupiers were not all-powerful. Every captured supply wagon was food for hungry rebels and hunger for English garrisons. Occupation is a machine fueled by fear and logistics. Wallace attacked both. At the same time, in the north. Andrew de Moray, a young noble who escaped English custody, raised rebellion in the Highlands. De Moray knew the politics of aristocratic war. Wallace knew the raw war of the dispossessed. Together, they represented something rare. Class divisions bending under a single purpose. They joined forces not because they loved each other, but because the arithmetic was clear, divided. They would be destroyed. And all roads led to Stirling, because Stirling was not just a castle on rock. It was the key to Scotland's throat. Stirling was geography turned into strategy. The River Forth twisted through low, marshy ground, and at one critical point, it narrowed enough for a wooden bridge, for an army of thousands. This bridge was not a crossing, it was a bottleneck. You couldn't surge over it at once. You had to pass in pieces, inching forward in armor, while the planks shook beneath hooves and boots. One fallen horse, one jammed cart, could turn the crossing into chaos. And beyond the bridge, the north bank offered terrible ground for cavalry. It was flat but soft, pocked with streams and bogs. The kind of place that turns heavy armor into dead weight. Knights needed solid ground and momentum. Here, momentum died in mud. Horses stumbled, men slipped. Those who fell were slow to rise. The English army arrived with the confidence of a power used to winning. John de Varennes, Earl of Surrey, commanded the force, supported by cavalry, infantry, and archers. But there was another voice pushing the decisions. Hugh Cressingham. He pressed for speed. He argued against delays and detours, because delays cost money, and money was his obsession. Some advisors suggested crossing at a ford upstream to outflank the Scots. Cressingham wanted the quickest solution: force the bridge. That is the fatal blindness of empire. The powerful often mistake impatience for efficiency. They forget that geography is not neutral. Sometimes the land itself is armed. Wallace and de Moray watched from Abbey Craig, a rise overlooking the bridge. They did not need to defeat the full English army. They only needed to destroy the portion that crossed before the rest could follow. It was not a heroic plan. It was a trap. A grim, practical calculation based on timing, terrain, and the certainty that English arrogance would do half the work for them. On the morning of September 11, 1297, the hookup of fate began. The English started their crossing. Hooves hammered on wood. Armor clattered. Orders echoed over the water. The bridge only allowed a few men abreast, so the advance moved slowly, like a metal serpent sliding into a noose. The Scots did nothing. They waited. That stillness was terrifying. A weak enemy usually panics, shoots too early, breaks formation. Wallace and de Moray held their men in place like a drawn blade. When enough English troops had crossed, enough to make the trap worthwhile, but not enough to overwhelm them, the signal came. The Scottish attack did not slam into the English center like blind rage. It struck the bridge. They targeted the choke point, the artery feeding the English vanguard. Men surged toward the crossing, fighting the troops, still trying to come over, turning the bridge into a jam of bodies, horses, and splintering planks. In that crush, a single stumble could cascade into disaster. The army behind could not help the army ahead. The river cut them in half. On the north bank, the trapped English tried to form battle lines, but the ground betrayed them. Cavalry could not charge. Horses sank and slipped. Men-at-arms struggled to maneuver in mud that grabbed their boots. The Scots fought close and brutal spears to pin, axes to break. Groups working together to haul armored men from their mounts. In that terrain, chivalric warfare collapsed. It became a slaughter of physics. And then there was Cressingham, the hated treasurer, the walking insult. He had urged the crossing, believing himself safe behind English steel. Now he was trapped inside the bag he helped tie shut. The sources differ on the exact moment he fell, but the meaning does not change. This was not a man being captured for ransom. This was a man being punished. The Scots did not see a cleric. They saw the hunger he caused. They saw the contempt he carried. They saw years of humiliation given a body and a name. Across the river, the English on the south bank could only watch. Some tried to swim. The fourth was cold, fast, and deadly. Armor dragged men down like stones. The river became an executioner that did not care about rank. By the end, Surrey had to retreat. The defeat was not merely a loss of soldiers. Empires can replace soldiers. What they cannot easily replace is certainty. Stirling Bridge punctured England's aura of inevitability. And once inevitability breaks, occupation becomes more expensive, more fragile, more haunted. After the fighting, the North Bank became a grim inventory. Armor was stripped from bodies because metal was more valuable than dignity. In a war of survival, swords, helms, All of it was taken, not as greed, but as necessity. For the Scots, loot was logistics. It was a way to turn one morning's victory into the chance of living through the next winter. But with Cressingham, death was not enough. He was singled out as more than a corpse. Medieval chronicles report that his body was flayed, skinned, not a random mutilation in the chaos of battle, but a deliberate act performed after the killing ended, when men had time. When anger could be shaped into ritual. You do not skin a man quickly without skill. You do not do it at all unless you intend the act to mean something. Why do this? First, revenge. Years of taxation, confiscation, and starvation demanded more than a clean death. Second, psychological war. In medieval society, burial and bodily integrity mattered, especially for the elite. Violating a body after death was a message. The old rules do not protect you here. And then came the legend. Some later Scottish accounts claim Wallace had strips of Cressingham's skin made into items, a sword belt, trophies distributed as proof, whether literal or embellished. The story spread like fire because it hit England where it hurt fear. It suggested that Scottish resistance would not behave like polite war between nobles. It would behave like a desperate people fighting for existence. This is what terror does. England used terror to control Scotland. Scotland responded by weaponizing terror of its own. The flaying became a grotesque mirror held up to the occupiers you made us suffer. Now we will make you remember. And that memory traveled faster than any messenger. It reached villages that had been too afraid to speak. It reached nobles who had been calculating which side would win. It reached English garrisons who suddenly realized that the countryside around them was not passive, it was watching, waiting, and capable of biting back. But Stirling Bridge did not end the war. It changed its temperature. Edward could tolerate rebellion, but he could not tolerate humiliation. Wallace's rise, and Cressingham's fate, turned Scottish resistance into a symbol that demanded an imperial response. Wallace was named Guardian of Scotland, but that title was also a target painted on his back. He needed allies, resources, and unity among nobles who often cared more about their own land than the nation. That unity was fragile. Some lords wanted independence but feared losing privileges. Some wanted compromise. Wallace, coming from lesser status, inspired commoners but triggered suspicion among parts of the aristocracy. Edward understood this. Empires excel at buying hesitation, rewarding fence-sitters, and letting opponents fracture themselves. Wallace struck back with raids into northern England, proving that Scotland could threaten English soil. But raids have consequences. Retaliation follows. Village burn. Civilians starve. The longer a war drags on, the more people crave an end. Any end. Occupation breaks bodies. Prolonged resistance can break patience. In 1298, at Falkirk, Edward applied the kind of combined force Stirling had neutralized archers and coordinated pressure. Scottish schiltrons, dense spear formations, could stop cavalry, but they could not stop arrows. Under-arrow fire. Those formations became traps for the men inside them. Falkirk was a brutal reminder that geography is not always on the side of the weak, and that long wars are contests of supply, discipline, and coalition building. After Falkirk, Wallace stepped back from leadership, but he did not vanish. He became a shadow. moving through forests and political corridors, trying to keep the idea of resistance alive. Shadows are hard to kill, but they are also hard to support. Over time, betrayal becomes a currency, a tip for silver, a handshake for protection, a name traded for a promise. This is the slow death of rebellions not always crushed in one battle, but starved, isolated, and sold piece by piece. Edward did not need to win every clash. He needed to make Scotland tired enough to begin doubting itself. In 1305, Wallace was captured and taken to London like a trophy. The trial was not about truth. It was a performance of power. He was called a traitor, though he had never sworn loyalty to Edward. The verdict was predetermined because the goal was not justice, it was deterrence. His execution was designed as theater: dragged, hanged, cut down, disemboweled, beheaded, quartered. Each step was a lesson written on flesh. The pieces of his body were sent to different places, like signposts. This is what happens when you defy a king. Edward believed he was sealing the coffin of Scottish rebellion, but you cannot imprison memory the way you imprison a man. Like the story of Cressingham's skin, Wallace's death became fuel. The cruelty meant to terrify also ensured the tale would be repeated. Around fires, in taverns, in the tight silence of villages that had learned to survive by not speaking too loudly. That is why Stirling Bridge still haunts history. Not because it was just a battle, but because it was the moment a people realized mud, timing, and nerve could shatter steel. Cressingham did not merely die, he was transformed into a warning. A grotesque proof that oppression is not invincible. Comment below what hit you hardest: the trap of the bridge, the panic in the marsh, or the cold message carved into a corpse after the fighting ended. This is Medieval Spirits. We dig up the bones of history to find the truth buried beneath the lies. And in Scotland, Iten Laumbe Joshati, that truth smells like wet earth, iron, and wood splintering under the weight of imperial arrogance.